Welcome to the FASA Leadership Lounge, where we discuss various policies impacting Florida school leaders. I am Michelle White, Executive Director of the Florida Association of School Administrators.
And I am Jessica Janasiewicz. I serve as the lobbyist for FASA and a number of school districts here in the state of Florida. We've made it through week 6 of the legislative session, and with only 3 weeks to go, we have a lot to talk about.
Yes, we do. First, let's talk about a couple of bills that are already off to the governor. So we have House Bill 575 and 549, which both deal with renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. These bills have both passed the House and the Senate on the floor. They are ready for the governor for his signature. Districts would only have to update their instructional materials when new ones are adopted or purchased starting after July 1. So we've been talking about this a couple of times. Just want to reassure all of our school district leaders, especially in curriculum
Mhm.
and instruction, materials that are already in our schools are okay until it's time for a next adoption.
Absolutely. There's been a lot of discussion about the proposed budgets from the House and the Senate, particularly surrounding the proposals that are looking at the weighted add on FTE issue, which is dealing with the AP, IB, dual enrollment, and ACE courses. As a result, we thought it might be helpful to explain the budget process because it is a little different than our typical policy process. It's important to note that the only thing the legislature has to do is pass a budget. They do not have to pass any policy. The budget process is different than the typical process for passing policy. So let's take a deep dive and let's go to budget school, shall we?
I love it.
The This is how the process works and this is where we start, okay? So it all begins with the Legislative Budget Commission who issues the long-range financial outlook. This gives the House and the Senate, who we call the appropriators, an idea of what our funding outlook will be, what they think we're going to have insofar as dollars to fund our state. Then state agencies submit their legislative budget requests. They say, this is what we would like for the upcoming budget year to have to fund and run our agencies.
And that's usually done in the fall.
That's correct. This would all be in the fall. Then the governor is required to make his recommendation 30 days before the legislative session. He can get it in earlier if he chooses to, but it has to be there 30 days before session begins. Then the first step for both the House and the Senate is to develop their own budgets, and that includes conforming bills. These are bills that we use to conform statute to the budget allocations. So if they create a program, think about the teacher salary allocation. They created this program, they say what they want you to do with this money, and then the money is allocated in the budget. And during this point, they use their own idea for the amount of funds that they'll use. So the House and the Senate may have very different numbers as they build their budget. They then pass those budget bills in their subcommittees. So for us, that's the pre K 12 budget subcommittee. Then they take those bills that were passed and they are all passed in the large appropriation committee. So the big appropriations committee will pass the pre K 12 education budget, they will pass the transportation budget, they will pass healthcare, and so on and so on. Then from the big appropriations committee, it goes to the floor and each chamber will pass their own budgets. And it's important to note they are not the same budgets. They are simply what each chamber has developed. And this is where we are right now in the process. Both chambers have passed their own respective budgets that are different. This sets us up for budget conferencing, which is a unique process and it's not exactly the same as what we think about with our typical committee structure. Before we can begin conference, the presiding officers have to decide on allocations. This is the overall amount of money that the budget will be built with. It will also decide how much each portion of the budget that each area will get. So, education will get X, and transportation will get this much money, and healthcare will get this. So that they start with a number as they begin the process. Just to give you an idea, at the end of last year, when we had our final budget passed, the budget was $116.5 billion. That was the big budget. And education was about 31 billion of that number. The presiding officers then name budget leaders and what they call conferees. These are joint committees. So these committees have both House and Senate members on them. They also set the schedule for the time in which they'll work. This year, the Senate is hosting the budget. What does this mean? Well, it doesn't really mean that they have any more power than anyone else, but it does mean that the committees will be in Senate committee rooms The official chair will be a senator, with the vice chair being a House member, but they have the same level of power. So it's not that there's anything different there. And then the big thing is ultimately the bill numbers that pass will be Senate bills. So we will have Senate Bill 2500 at the end of the day that has the compromise language. Then we start with subcommittee work. The leaders for pre K 12 education appropriations will be our subcommittee chairs. So we'll have Senator Burgess and Representative Persons Maleka who lead this effort. Various members of the committee will come and be on this committee. They'll be appointed. So if they sat on the pre K 12 appropriations committee, they will more than likely be a part of the conferencing committee. The various budgets committees will meet. So pre K 12 education will meet, transportation will meet. Everybody's going to be meeting and they will present offers to one another and then accept or reject them. So the Senate may come forth with this is our idea for the funding for the FEFP. Here's our idea for these projects. And then the House will come back and they'll say, well, we reject this offer for such and such, but we accept this other one. And they just go back and forth, accepting and rejecting offers. This occurs typically all day and night, and even over the weekend during this time. Once we reach that period of time that was determined by the presiding officers for things to wrap up, any unresolved issues will bump to what we call the big chairs. These are the leaders of our appropriations committee. So it's Chairman Senator Hooper and Representative McClure. They will then get all of the unresolved issues from all of the areas of budget. So they'll get anything from pre K 12 that was unresolved, anything from healthcare, anything from criminal justice, et cetera, et cetera. They will then work through the same kind of process, accepting and rejecting offers from one another. Once they reach the deadline, if there are any other unresolved issues, those bump up to the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate. And they then determine, go back and forth until we have everything resolved and everything is agreed upon. And then they will officially publish the budget. Once they publish the budget, nothing will change in the budget from this point forward. And when they publish the budget, the clock starts ticking. And that is because in Florida, the budget has to quote unquote rest for 72 hours so that members can have time to read and understand what is in the budget before they can vote on it. So during this period, they can have discussion about the budget on the floor, debate about it, but they cannot vote until that 72 hours has passed. Once that has passed, the vote can occur. Typically, the budgets are the final things to pass through both chambers. Once that's complete, the presiding officers and their staff coordinate the end of session, which is what is known as sine die, and that means without day. So that means we have no meeting planned for the future because we have concluded our work. Just to give everyone an idea of where we are, the current budgets, as passed by the House and the Senate, are approximately $4.4 billion apart. This is obviously a pretty huge gap. And until it's resolved, we can't have allocations to determine how we can have this conferencing to begin. A big reason for this gap is some differences in policy. And there was a potential sales tax cut, which was brought forth by the House and voted on as part of their budget. And it would lower our sales tax rate. But obviously, that would result in reduced funding. So the House's budget is significantly lower than that of the Senate. And they have to get to that same amount in order to pass it. So I know that was a lot, but just for people who are interested in learning to and wanting to get involved and wanting to give their opinion about what they see in the various budgets, we have not begun that conferencing process. So there is still time to reach out to your legislators and tell them how you feel about various parts of the budgets.
That's right. Well, I wanted to make sure that we talk too about where are they already in agreement? And we
Hmm.
know a couple of things on the positive
Yep.
side, right? We'll talk about some ways that they're also disagreeing,
Mhm.
but as it relates to education, one area where they are in alignment is around students that receive scholarships
Mhm.
for private school or homeschool.
Mhm.
And what the policy is leading the way on that so that there can be more transparency in that funding and making sure that the funding truly does follow the student
Mhm.
is that every student must be assigned a student number by the Department of Education. And that way, everything is tracked based off of student number and where that student actually is at the time of the counts. So that is a positive and
Yes,
will help our school district significantly as we have students coming and going from private schools and public schools and everything in between.
absolutely.
The second area is that the DOE has to investigate any discrepancies and money around those scholarship dollars that cannot be released until it's resolved. So if students are showing up into places, they have to investigate and figure that out before money is released. So
Mhm.
they are working together in those areas.
Absolutely. And to get to where they are in some disagreement, obviously we talked about the big number, which is the big overriding disagreement, but there are a couple things within our budget, in the education budget, where they're not seeing eye to eye just yet. The first that comes to mind is the funding levels. The House is proposing a 0.7% increase, whereas the Senate is proposing a 1.25% increase. So obviously the Senate is higher there. They also have a disagreement about the handling of the scholarships. The House wants to keep things as they are with the scholarships in the FEFP flowing through the FEFP. The Senate would like to pull those out and have them be separate and not go through the FEFP. So that's a kind of a philosophical difference there as well.
Yeah, and the budget process, like you said, Jessica, is really still in flux. It's still a great time to reach out and let
Yes.
your local delegation know
Mhm.
how you're feeling about what policies are being put forward. Please share the message
Yes.
with real numbers of how these changes in policy and budget is going to impact your school, your students, your community, especially as it relates to those AP and CAPE and ACE and IB programs.
I think that's a really important point, Michelle, is it's very important to come with data. They the first question you will likely be asked if you come forth and say you don't like this policy is going to be why. And if you can say specifically the impact that it would have on your district, that will make a big difference in your argument.
Absolutely. So policy side of things, outside of the budget, we wanna talk about school safety. It's
Yeah.
always top of mind. I think we've touched on it almost every episode so far
Mhm.
of the Leadership Lounge, but we wanna make sure we cover a number of these bills. So, on the Senate side, Senate Bill 1470 and 1472, they are actually linked together in their language, and they are seeking to strengthen safety measures, enhance behavioral threat management protocols, expand oversight of security personnel, and clarifies our locked campus requirements. So, we have been working on that topic along with a number of other education organizations around the student instructional time and supervision,
Mhm.
times of supervision, really. And instead of just this general figure of when students are on campus. So it really narrows that down and hopefully will help our schools be able to man those gates and those doors a little bit
Yeah.
easier. The Senate versions have passed on the floor. They are on their way over to the House in what they call messages.
Mhm.
And the House companion bill is still awaiting its last committee stop. So, knowing that this is such a priority for our districts, of course, we are trying to pursue that to the very end, of
Mhm.
course.
Mhm.
The next bill I want to talk about is Senate Bill 1374. It passed its final committee stop and it's now headed for the floor vote by the Senate. The bill would require more detailed reporting on educators accused of crimes.
Mhm.
And so the goal is making sure that if there are some serious allegations and arrests made, that educators would have to self-report any of these accusations within 48 hours of arrest.
Mhm.
Districts would then have to remove teachers from classrooms within 24 hours.
Mhm.
They can be paid put on paid leave as investigations are done, but they need to be removed or reassigned their duties that are separate from our students.
Mhm.
Then they have to have a disciplinary hearing within a year within the district
Mhm.
since that removal to determine what further actions should be taken.
Mhm.
So a similar bill over in the House, it's not identical. is 1287, and it has already been scheduled for a reading on the
Mm.
floor as well. So we're waiting to hear what's going to happen to that, but I know that that will be something very important to our district and school leaders and just thinking about what happens after hours with
Yes.
those on campus.
Mhm.
Further, we have 2 bills that relate to educator certification and training as it relates to mass casualty incidents. They kind of seem to be stuck right now in
Mm.
full transparency. House Bill 37 has passed one of 2 committees, and Senate Bill 204 has not moved at all.
Mhm.
So, while we know that this is probably something that our educators do need, and we hate to even talk about the need for
Mhm.
that, but the
Mm.
reality is that it may not be put into statute as a requirement. It's always something that districts could do even if they wanted to.
Sure.
And the last ones that I want to highlight around safety is House Bill 1237 and Senate Bill 444, which are identical, and they would require public and charter schools to train employees to identify potential students victimized by human trafficking and then take necessary action. So, currently, schools are required to provide instruction regarding human trafficking for students, but there is no mandatory training for personnel. Right now, the House version has been added to the floor calendar. We're waiting for the vote. The Senate still has one more committee stop, but this would be required training for our educators.
And there have been a number of other bills that have been moving this week. We had Senate Bill 1678, which penalizes what the legislature calls academic boycotts of Israel. Essentially, this bill would look at anyone that is trying to take any action, be it a school or a non governmental agency, in any way to take a negative action towards Israel. So, divesting, perhaps, anything like that, certain policies. That passed on the Senate floor this week. If there were any impacted schools, they would have 90 days to correct their noncompliance, and public funds cannot be invested in companies that are identifying as cutting Israel. The House version of the bill has also been moving, House Bill 1519, and it's ready for a floor vote as well. Senate Bill 1458 was heard in committee this week, while the House version 681 was placed on the calendar. So they're both moving along. These bills aim to provide funding for apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship programs and also require the DOE to develop a model contract and a funding transparency tool. So we know we have that model contract for charter schools right now. So same kind of idea to have one contract that everyone uses. A few weeks ago, we talked about a proposal to put term limits for county commissioners and school board members on the ballot as a constitutional amendment. The House version, which is House Bill 679, is ready for a floor vote, and the Senate version still has 2 committee stops. So we're getting a little bit late in the process if we have 2 committee stops left, but of course, anything can happen. As a reminder, this was put into statutes for school board members, but this would make it so that it was actually on as part of our Constitution and therefore would be very difficult to change. You'd have to do another constitutional amendment. So it would be much harder to change than something just in statute.
Right. So, other things that we're starting to think about, right, is where some trains may come together for
Hmm.
sure. Um, FASA has some concerns around House Bill 18. It talks about how schools can join as membership
Hmm.
to certain organizations, certainly want to make sure that any organization is not discriminatory that we're
Yes.
joining, right? But just there's a lot of language in the Senate side,
Hmm.
so that's Senate Bill 1618, that could grow into a potential train because of the way other language is
Hmm.
getting tacked onto it very quickly,
Yes.
it seems. So, also House Bill 123. This is something we've talked about previously as well in the conversion of traditional public schools into charter schools by a municipality. So, what the language said originally was that municipalities could convert traditional public schools into a charter if the school grade was below an A for 5 years or more, and the bill also addressed surplus property that was owned by a school district and the ability to purchase. new property when there's also a decline of enrollment.
Mhm.
That, of course, had been problematic in a number of ways for our schools and our districts. So this week, the bill was amended to remove the language regarding the surplus property
Mhm.
and the purchase of the new property issue. So that is a great step forward, certainly.
Sure.
The bill does still have language that removes the votes for teachers in that conversion process.
Mm.
The bill is waiting for a floor vote, and a similar Senate bill, not identical, but similar, number 140, it has moved through 2 committees, still has 1 stop to go before the floor. So, time will tell what is
Time will
happening.
tell. It is interesting, typically bills that have been both moving like this, there tends to be a time where they come to agreement. And to have this language come out of the House bill, we'll have to see when that Senate bill makes the next committee stop if it then mirrors the language and sets them up to pass.
For sure. And so the last bill to talk about this week is House Bill 1309, which relates to reading instruction and required professional learning on interventions and instruction. It would create a reading coach allocation
Mm.
as well. So the House bill is ready for a floor vote.
Mm.
However, the similar Senate bill has not been heard in committee at all.
Mhm.
It is very likely this bill is not going to move forward,
Mm.
but it is something, of course, for us to keep our eyes on.
Yes, and we always want to keep those in mind for next year because things that don't make it all the way through the process in one year, oftentimes you can see them again in the future. So, what's next for us in this legislative session as we enter week 7? From a budget perspective, we're awaiting the allocations to begin negotiations. The House policy subcommittees are no longer meeting, much like their Senate counterparts who stopped their policy committees after week 5. So we can expect fewer committees to meet, and those that do meet, like our big appropriations committee, rules committee, et cetera, will meet for extended periods of time, sometimes even all day. Sometimes you'll see a Senate appropriations meeting from 9 o'clock to 6 o'clock. We'll also see the chamber spending more time on the floor where they will debate, and vote on bills.
Absolutely. And I would encourage everyone to read through their Monday news tracker.
Mm.
So, all of our full service members should be getting their news tracker Monday through Friday, talking about top stories in education news around the state and the country. But it also has a great synopsis of what's on the calendar for
Mm.
the week and what committees are meeting or when are they on the floor. So, definitely watch for that. And that is our update for this week. We appreciate y'all listening. Please share the FASA Leadership Lounge with your colleagues. And it is one way that is completely free that FASA is hoping to support all administrators and educators through these policy times and just as we move forward. Again, the FASA website is always available at FASA.net. If you click on the advocacy section, you can see a full list of bills that we are following. So stay tuned for more.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lounge podcast presented by the Florida Association of School Administrators. Today's podcast was hosted by Michelle White and Jessica Janasiewicz. The podcast is produced by Jeff Willoughby. Special thanks to musical director David Higgins. Make sure to subscribe to the Leadership Lounge podcast wherever you find your favorite podcasts. New episodes are released each Monday. For show topic suggestions, questions, or comments, please email communications@fasa.net. We hope you enjoyed the show.